Hi, this is your host Swapnil Bhartia and welcome to another episode of TFR Insights. Red Hat recently published open source participation guidelines. Red Hat, if you look at Red Hat, they not only release their code as open source, but they also contribute heavily to many open source projects. So when you look at document like this is a great value that they are bringing, not only to help us understand how the company itself deals with open source, but it can also be a very good resource for other companies who are engaging with open source. To talk about this document today, we have with us Ruth Suehle, Director of Community Outreach Open Source Program Office at Red Hat. So let's talk about this document. When we look at companies, when they deal with open source, of course, they do pay a lot of attention to licenses and CLAs because they don't want to engage. They don't want their employees to contribute to any project which can have conflict with licenses. They have very strict policies around that. But do they also have policies or documentation how to participate with open source?
Sure. I think some companies do, for sure. Other companies that have a lot of associates participating in open source software projects. My own experience as an associate is very Red Hat focused since I've been here for over 13 years. But when I talk to folks, colleagues at other companies, conferences and such, I find that they do have these sorts of documents, though they often look somewhat different. I think there are fewer of them at companies where there aren't already lots of people contributing to open source just because they haven't found a need for it yet. Although if they come across this, perhaps they will find that it could be useful to them to implement one and encourage more participation. They do often, however, look different at other companies who do have them. Red Hat is unique. Red Hat is Red Hat. And so companies often have concerns that we don't spend as much time worrying about. This document is intended to be very freeing, very free of restrictions, whereas many similar documents at other companies are about defining the boundaries, drawing the lines, creating restrictions about how they allow their associates to participate in open source projects. And this is quite the opposite of that. If I could summarize it, it would simply be to go contribute.
What was the need to bring this document out now, also putting it in public?
We originally created this document internally. It is first and foremost effectively an internal policy document, but we never intended for it to stay that way. Ever since we began it, we knew that eventually we would open it to the public. And so since it is truly an internal document in intent, that is how it began life, but we treated it effectively like an open source project. Red Hat has something called the Open Decision Framework, which is actually also on GitHub. Anyone could go adopt it and apply it in their companies as well. The Open Decision Framework is a way to apply the principles of open source development, the collaboration, the transparency, all of that to decision making. And so to use this project as an example of how that works in practice, I drafted the first version of these guidelines with the help of my colleagues in the Open Source Program Office, as well as Red Hat's legal team. And so we drafted what to us was the general understanding of how Red Hatters participate in open source projects. But because what we were doing was writing down what was simply unwritten long-time understanding, it was important that what we were writing down was not my understanding and not the OSPO's understanding or even the OSPO and legal's understanding, but that it reflected what everyone at Red Hat believed to be the way we participate in open source projects. And so step 2 is to take that draft to the entire company. We have, even today, an all-company mailing list that everyone is subscribed to. And we sent it out and sought feedback and contributions from anyone who was interested in having their say about what they thought was the way we participate in open source projects. And so if it reads a little more casually than an internal policy document generally would, that's A, sort of intentional, and B, reflects the fact that this is a collaborative document. It is the work of many, many Red Hatters around the world. As far as releasing it to the public, then we recently put it out on GitHub so that anyone could adopt it, because we do believe that it is the right way to encourage open source participation among your associates. And so we put it out on GitHub so that it is its own project. Anyone is free to read it, use it, fork it, make their own changes, adopt it, and we really hope that folks do.
If I ask you to just give me 2 or 3 highlights, what are the key highlights of this document?
I think there are probably actually 2 or 3 sentences in the document itself that are alone great summaries of the entire thing. The first is the first sentence of the third section, which says, Red Hat associates are highly encouraged to participate in open source projects. That is an excellent summary of what the whole thing is all about. Simply, we encourage you to go forth and participate. The second would be the concept of upstream first, which is an important part of Red Hat's philosophy, that we do everything in the upstream. So any contributions, any bug fixes, patches, we first propose be merged into the upstream, or we create initially there, because for many reasons, simply because it is the right way to do things, but maintaining a downstream fork is actually a burden. It's a terrible way to go about things. And so our upstream first philosophy is in there. And then finally, if I could summarize all of it in 3 words, it is another long-time, almost Red Hat catchphrase, summary of our philosophy that we do write down in here, and that is default to open. So it is an excellent guiding principle for anyone who wants to work in open source, whether that is in the traditional sense of in code, or if it is simply that you would like to apply those principles more broadly to whatever it is you do. It is a guiding principle, default to open and only be closed when absolutely necessary.
That's a good point. Now, if you look at this document, you already mentioned that it's there, people can fork it and they can do whatever they can. But can this also be used by other companies? Red Hat has a unique culture. Not every company has the same culture. Some have open core projects. Different companies have different approaches toward open source. Can they also leverage this document in one capacity or the other?
I think it would be fantastic if every company out there got on GitHub, grabbed our open source participation guidelines and adopted them for their own use. It would be particularly fantastic if they decided to leave them as is in the current state that is intended to allow as much free participation in open source as possible. I understand that for many companies that is unlikely, that they have their own restrictions they will want to apply. But again, by using that default to open philosophy, by only closing off the things that you really absolutely must truly close off for your business needs, I think will result in benefits for the whole open source ecosystem, which is really what all of this was about. It's about the fact that the more contributions we can encourage, the better off everyone in the broad open source ecosystem is. From the perspective of whether other folks benefit from Red Hat having done this, even if they didn't adopt it themselves, then sure, because again, it circles back to the more contributions we can encourage, the better off everyone is. And that's what this document is about encouraging Red Hat associates, regardless of their role, regardless of their skill, to go and make contributions to open source projects to benefit the greater ecosystem.
If there are companies who look at this document and they get inspired by it, what should they kind of consider when they try to create their own guiding document? And they can borrow from it or they can create their own original. But what are some key points that they should look at?
I think it would be ideal if folks adopted it as is, of course, because we believe this is the right way to do things. That's the way that we wrote it for that reason. But I do understand, again, that not everyone is Red Hat, and other companies will have the restrictions that they want to draw around how associates participate in open source. So I'll give the example of the one restriction that we do draw on this, and that's around third-party agreements. So if someone is asked to sign a CLA, for example, we ask them to pass it by the legal team. Now, we do maintain a list internally of all the really common ones, the ones that people are most likely to encounter on the most popular open source projects, the ones that we're most frequently contributing to. And I do think that that would be an excellent addition if a company was going to adopt this, to maintain a similar list of pre-approved CLAs for associates. I imagine as whomever is the legal team person who approves all of those requests, it relieves a great burden to have a pre-approved set for sure. But yeah, I would love to see any company who would like to adopt a similar philosophy to use our guidelines as a start. They're welcome to reach out to me if they have any questions about how we do it, and I am happy to talk to anyone about that.
And the funny thing is that, whenever we talk open source, Red Hat's name come up, people always talk, hey, the Red Hat model, the Red Hat way of doing things. So you are in the center of open source. But one thing I also want to know from you is you have been this community, this industry, this ecosystem for so long. What kind of trend are you seeing? Because companies, as we discussed earlier, are embracing open source. They are consuming and using open source a lot. Do you see any change within companies' culture also, which may move them also in the same direction where they will have much more structured approach towards involving with open source?
As more companies are seeing the benefits of open source software, I think that they are seeing the benefits of open source in other areas as well. And this is actually something that I worked on earlier in my time at Red Hat. About 10 years ago, we launched OpenSource.com, which is still around. You can go hit it and check out all sorts of interesting open source news. But one of the things we've had on there since the beginning is discussions of open source in business. So not software, but how the open source principles, collaboration, transparency, meritocracy, how those can be applied to business practices. And back, maybe 10 years ago or more, I think that we were telling stories of companies who had open business practices, who were doing really interesting things that perhaps were not the norm, maybe still aren't in some cases, but they were companies that perhaps were outside of software altogether or not users, not participating in open source. I think it's starting to happen more the other way around. So I think everyone would agree that we're seeing a lot more interest in open source software. A lot more companies that didn't used to see the value are now believers in open source software. And I think that we're starting to see cultures change as a result of that instead of the other way around. That as they see the benefits of openness in software, they're seeing the benefits of openness applied to other parts of their business as well. And that's really exciting to see.
Can you talk about the importance of diversity and also what efforts are going on, not only from Red Hat as a company, but also as a member of ecosystem to further encourage inclusion and diversity?
Diversity is, of course, incredibly important to open source development because it is practically fundamental to the entire concept. Because open source is about bringing the best ideas to the table, and the best ideas win. We don't get the best ideas if we're only bringing the same types of folks to that table. So encouraging more diversity in projects is incredibly important. And I think we're seeing improvements in that. Certainly, a lot of us still have some room to grow, but we're seeing a lot of improvements. And Red Hat has a number of diversity and inclusion initiatives that I'm pleased to have worked on. One that actually gives a really great example is a project we do called CoLab. And it's a program to encourage more girls in STEM fields. So we decided not to teach a coding camp. There are plenty of those. What we really wanted to teach them was the foundational principle of open source. It's called CoLab because we're teaching them about collaboration. And we do that through a number of curricula. We've done Raspberry Pi ones and Arduino ones. The one I'm working on right now is based around video game development. And in the course of that, I talked to them about how important diversity is when you're playtesting your game. That if you just playtest it with a group of friends who are exactly like you won't find as many things as you would have if you had play tested with a more diverse group. Because one of the examples I give them, not necessarily a traditional diversity point, but if you have no one who is colorblind testing your game, then you may never know that there's a screen they can't get past because they can't actually see what's supposed to be on it. So getting more perspectives, people from different abilities as well as different backgrounds, different experiences, all of those people will have a different experience of your game or of whatever your software project is. It's important to have those points of view. And so that's how I describe it to this one group that I work with. Another project through Red Hat that I've been pleased to work on lately, diversity related, is I've been working with IBM to launch the Call for Code for Racial Justice project, which is also now on GitHub. There are an assortment of software projects built around 3 themes around racism that we would love to see more folks come and contribute to those projects. There are some solution starters in there, some resources to help people get started. And I'd love to see some folks showing up in there. Red Hat, of course, has a number of more of diversity and inclusion sorts of initiatives. We could talk about that for days, but so diversity is super important to open source projects in general, and I hope everyone is looking into ways that they can help grow those.
Ruth, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule today and talk about this document, and I look forward to talk to you again. Thank you.